Years have passed since Mom left, but the house still whispers her name in every corner. Lavender lingers, and so does the ache we can't escape. What would you do if you returned home after your husband's funeral, only to find your sister-in-law and her husband already moved in with their luggage? She claimed, "This house and the $66 million are now mine, and I sold your belongings, so get out." I couldn't help but laugh because this house was... Let's dive into this surprising and dramatic story. I'm a 35-year-old office worker, and my husband Richard, who is 6 years older than me, and I have been married for 9 years. Right now, due to some circumstances, I'm living with my mom. Let me explain how I ended up in this situation. 4 years ago, Richard and I decided to build a house. At that time, Richard had just changed jobs, and we didn't have much money saved or a high income. Richard had previously worked for a large company, but he faced constant hidden bullying from his boss. This caused him severe sleep problems, and eventually, he couldn't go to work anymore. He saw a psychiatrist and took a break for about 3 months, but when he didn't feel better, he quit his job. After that, we had to get by on just my salary. Richard didn't work for 3 months, but gradually, he started to feel better. He began eating and sleeping well again, and his psychiatrist was pleased with his quick recovery. My cheerful, loving Richard was back. He then started looking for a new job. His experience at the big company helped, but finding a job was difficult since he had left his previous position due to mental health issues. During this time, we found a small company that needed him. The salary was about 4/5 of what he had been earning before, but Richard was just happy to be working again. He said it was much better than being unemployed, and that made me happy too. This job was also in the field he wanted to work in. We had always talked about having children, but it was clear that life would be tough if I stopped working, so I continued my job. I also loved my work, so we decided not to have children at that time. For a while, life was peaceful, just the 3 of us, until my mother, Eleanor, was paralyzed in a car accident and needed a wheelchair to get around. My father had passed away when I was in middle school, and Eleanor had been living alone since then. Our family home was old, full of steps, and not suitable for wheelchair access. Richard, being the caring person he is, said, "I'm worried, let's live together." Eleanor and I were surprised, but I was deeply moved by Richard's unexpected kindness. Since Richard had just changed jobs, we were unsure about the future, but we decided to apply for a mortgage. As expected, it was tough to get a loan because Richard hadn't been at his job for long. But we were determined, and after trying several mortgage companies, we finally found one that worked with us and approved our loan. We bought our dream home, one I had always imagined filled with the scent of wood, thick wooden beams on the ceiling, custom storage spaces, a kitchen tailored for my height, and spacious cypress flooring. Most importantly, it was a single-story, barrier-free house, perfect for my mother's wheelchair. We were so excited as the house was being built and visited the construction site every day. When our carefully designed home was finished, it had a large yard where my mom, who rarely went outside, could enjoy the sunshine. However, there was a catch with the land. It had been given to us by Richard's grandfather, who adored him. Richard's family wasn't wealthy, but when his grandfather was diagnosed with cancer, he started distributing his assets, giving us the largest plot of land. It felt like we had won the lottery, but the land was just a 10-minute walk from Richard's family home. When we told Richard's family that my mother would be moving in with us, Richard's sister laughed and said, "Why is your mother moving in too? How shameless is your family?" Richard's mother told me, "Marrying someone like you will only bring trouble." She harshly added that it was terrible for her son to have to care for an elderly person and called me a curse. Despite all this, Richard stood by my mother and me. He said that the land was a gift from his grandfather and that no one had any right to complain. Richard's mother and sister are really mean. It's amazing that Richard, who is so kind, comes from that family. He's like a beautiful flower that grew out of mud. Richard always says his family shows him how not to be. Richard thinks his grandfather gave us the land because he wanted us to take care of his mother in her old age. He also gave other properties away. Richard's sister got a parking lot that's a 10-minute walk from their home. It's smaller than our land but makes good money from parking fees. Honestly, I would have preferred that. But a gift is still a gift, and we are thankful. Thanks to my grandfather-in-law, we could build our house without paying for the land and used it to help get a loan. When the house was finished, we invited Richard's mother and sister's family over. The builders told us they had visited the house several times without asking us. They showed up late without apologizing and said, "This is kind of like Grandpa's house, so it's like our house too." Richard's sister came in with muddy shoes and said the house smelled nice and didn't need air fresheners. She and her husband walked around with muddy shoes, ignoring the slippers we offered. When I suggested they use slippers, she laughed and said it was too much trouble and we could just clean the floor. The visit was uncomfortable from the start and they didn't bring anything with them. When they saw my mother's room, which is spacious and sunny, Richard's mother said she would like that room. My mother's room is like a duplex with its own kitchen, almost a second living space. "I want to live here," said my mother-in-law during the third point of her conversation. She then told my mother, "You were lucky to have that accident, weren't you? Thanks to being paralyzed, you moved from that old shack to this nice house. Isn't that a lucky turn of events?" My mother said nothing but looked very sad. I was really angry inside, but before I could say anything, Richard spoke up. "What did you just say? There are things you should and shouldn't say. It makes me question your humanity. I can't even believe you're part of my family. You're the worst. Apologize now," Richard demanded firmly. Whether they were amused or not, my mother and sister-in-law glared at me. Then my sister-in-law angrily asked Richard, "What's this all about? It's a total turn-off. It's not cool to invite people over and then be rude to them. Just because you built a house you think you can act superior?" The mother-in-law chimed in, "My son messed up by marrying you. You're a jinx." Richard didn't stay silent. "Enough is enough. This mess started because of your rude comments. You said the accident was a good thing and called my wife a jinx. I will not forgive that." The mother and sister-in-law looked frustrated by Richard's strong response. Then my mother, who had been watching everything, said with regret, "It's okay. I am here because of the accident, and it's true I moved from a rundown house to this beautiful one. Your son has always been kind to me. Thank you." Perhaps feeling guilty, the mother and sister-in-law left, giving me a nasty look. My mother then apologized to Richard. "I'm sorry if I upset your mother and sister. I'm sorry for ruining the mood at our housewarming party." Richard responded softly, "No, I should be the one apologizing. It's embarrassing how they lack decency. I'm truly sorry, but I am happy to be living with you. Please understand that." With those words, my mother began to tear up. Since we lived near Richard's parents' house, the neighbors all knew us well. They had known Richard since he was a child and were always kind to us. 4 months passed, and we were finally settling into our new home. My mother began to smile more, showing signs of comfort. But then, one day while I was at work, I received an unexpected call from home. We rarely got calls from home, so my heart sank immediately. My bad feeling turned out to be right. My mother, sounding extremely upset, told me something awful. Richard had collapsed at work. I was in shock and rushed to speak with my boss, then quickly headed for the hospital. On the way there, I tried to stay calm, imagining Richard would be okay when I arrived, cracking jokes as he always did. But when I got to the hospital, my world shattered. There he was, connected to so many tubes. We had plans to see a movie that weekend, and yet, here he was, in critical condition. The doctor said he might not wake up. I felt like I was watching some horrible movie. I couldn't even cry. Despite my prayers, Richard passed away that night. The shock was overwhelming as my mother and sister-in-law arrived. Upon hearing the news, my sister-in-law harshly accused me, asking if I had poisoned him or was after his life insurance. My mother-in-law joined in, blaming me, saying bad things always happened around me, and that I was a jinx. I was too numb with grief to respond. Then, my mother arrived in a hired taxi, tears flowing as she cried for Richard, and only then did I allow myself to cry too. We both sobbed loudly, sharing our grief. But my mother-in-law rudely told us to stop the fake crying. She said Richard had changed because of me and that she didn't want to see us ever again. Then, she stormed out of the hospital. A funeral director came to organize Richard's funeral, and we made our way to the funeral home. Richard had died from a brain hemorrhage, which felt almost impossible to believe he'd been fine just that morning. When I told my mother-in-law about the funeral plans, she barely acknowledged them and said she wouldn't attend because Richard had always sided with me and my mother. She also said her daughter wouldn't come. Many of Richard's co-workers and friends attended the viewing, but neither my mother nor my sister-in-law and her husband were there. Yet, despite their absence, many people attended the funeral, and it was clear that Richard had been deeply loved. The outpouring of grief from those who truly cared for him was overwhelming. It was hard, but I was grateful to spend the whole day with people who genuinely missed my husband. After Richard's death, I received an email from my mother-in-law, but it was utterly inappropriate, so I chose not to reply. She was asking about the life insurance money, and she continued to email, demanding a response. Eventually, she claimed she had a right to it. I decided to ignore her. I wasn't ready to deal with that yet. When we finally got home, I noticed a light on inside, which was strange. My mother, Eleanor, was confused, thinking we had turned off all the lights. I assumed I must have forgotten in my emotional state. I reassured her, saying it was understandable given everything, and unlocked the door. As we stepped inside, we heard the sound of the TV, which was even more odd. To our shock, we found my sister-in-law and her husband sitting in our living room. I was so stunned that I couldn't speak. The living room was filled with unfamiliar furniture and boxes. My sister-in-law said, "Why did you just barge in here?" "Well, it's your first time, so I'll let it slide. We're taking this house. We sold your stuff, so leave." My mother and I stood there in disbelief. I asked where our belongings had gone, and she casually replied that a resale company had come and taken everything, claiming we had good furniture and they were able to get a good price for it. They had bought new furniture with that money, dismissing our things as bad luck because they had been used by a dead person. She even added that she cared about such things and remarked that we must be minimalists or just poor since we had so few things. The furniture was carefully chosen by my husband and I couldn't forgive them for this. My mom was furious too, her face turning beet red, but she was too shocked to respond. I immediately called the resale company. After explaining the situation, they agreed to treat the items as stolen and return them. Now that my husband is gone, dealing with this was the last thing I needed. I don't want anything to do with his family, but I do want to stay in the house that's full of memories of him. While I was wrestling with these feelings, my mother quietly said to me, "What do you think Richard would say if he were here now?" "He might say we should leave. I'm sure he would." Richard often mentioned, "It's good to spend time with people who understand you, but there are some people who will never understand no matter how much you try. It's a waste of time dealing with those people." He was actually talking about his own mother and sister. I realized that if we stayed, his family would keep interfering. Acting on impulse, I signed a lease for an accessible apartment. My mom was surprised by how quickly I made that decision. I asked the resale company to hold on to the furniture for a few days, and it was moved to our new apartment 3 days later. In exchange for moving out, I made my mother-in-law and sister-in-law promise to cut ties with us. So a new life began for just my mother and me in the apartment. It turns out Richard had many life insurance policies almost obsessively, so he used to joke always with a smile, "When I die, you guys will be rich." True to his word, he left enough money for my mother and me to be comfortable for the rest of our lives. Since he couldn't secure a mortgage when we bought the house, I, being employed at a major corporation, bought the house in my name. I made sure that even if something happened to Richard first, I wasn't going to keep paying a mortgage for a house I wouldn't live in. According to our agreement, the house would be auctioned off if the mortgage wasn't paid for 4 months. Time flew by and 4 months passed quickly. Then I started receiving a lot of calls from my sister-in-law Tiffany and my mother-in-law Dolores. My call history was filled with their names, and it was getting scary like something out of a horror movie. They were incredibly persistent, so I finally answered the phone. They were furious because the house was being sold, Apparently, when they tried to return to the house, they found out they couldn't get in because of a seizure notice. Tiffany and her husband had moved out of their apartment since Richard passed away, and Tiffany had also quit her job. I suggested they move back into their parents' house since they were panicking about suddenly being homeless. Surprisingly, Dolores had gotten so caught up in gambling that she couldn't keep up and had sold her own house. It turns out they had been living together for the past 5 months. I also heard that they sold their main source of income, a parking lot in front of the train station, a long time ago. Now Dolores and Tiffany's family are completely homeless. When Dolores said, "I'm sorry for everything. Let's get along. Can you lend me some money, please?" I replied, "I think it's best if you stay away since I'm a jinx. We're strangers now that we've severed ties." Dolores was quiet after mumbling weakly. In my mind, I was thinking, who's the real bad luck charm here? Then when I said I wouldn't lend them a single cent, Tiffany, who had been listening next to Dolores, shouted, "You devil! Bring us the money right now!" "I am a devil and bad luck, so I'm going to hang up now," I replied, and ended the call. In reality, I involved a lawyer for the past 5 months to push for the auction of the house. I thought it was an unusual case, but apparently it's not that uncommon. The house was sold without any major issues, giving our family a moment of peace. We plan to find a new home with the money Richard left us. Since it's just my mother and me now, we don't need a big house. Instead, we're prioritizing security as 2 women living together, so I chose a condominium with minimal noise disturbance. I remember something Richard always said when we were building our home. People can get energy from the sun, so let's create a place where the mother-in-law can enjoy her hobby of reading in the garden without feeling self-conscious. With those words, he had designed a spacious courtyard for her. So now, I looked for a condo with a large balcony where she could enjoy her coffee and read in peace. It's smaller than our previous home, but the space is enough to house our furniture. Richard's choice of land, gifted to us by his grandfather, was expansive, and the house sold for more than expected. With that money, we're moving forward. I recently bought a luxurious condominium with exceptional security features, something I'm sure would have comforted Richard, who was always cautious. The peace of mind that comes from living in such a secure place feels invaluable, especially after the tumultuous experiences with my in-laws. While I was wrestling with these feelings, my mother quietly said to me, "What do you think Richard would say if he were here now?" "He might say we should leave. I'm sure he would." Richard often mentioned, "It's good to spend time with people who understand you, but there are some people who will never understand no matter how much you try. It's a waste of time dealing with those people." He was actually talking about his own mother and sister. I realized that if we stayed, his family would keep interfering. Acting on impulse, I signed a lease for an accessible apartment. My mom was surprised by how quickly I made that decision. I asked the resale company to hold on to the furniture for a few days, and it was moved to our new apartment 3 days later. In exchange for moving out, I made my mother-in-law and sister-in-law promise to cut ties with us. So a new life began for just my mother and me in the apartment. It turns out Richard had many life insurance policies almost obsessively, so he used to joke, always with a smile, "When I die, you guys will be rich." True to his word, he left enough money for my mother and me to be comfortable for the rest of our lives. Since he couldn't secure a mortgage when we bought the house, I, being employed at a major corporation, bought the house in my name. I made sure that even if something happened to Richard first, I wasn't going to keep paying a mortgage for a house I wouldn't live in. According to our agreement, the house would be auctioned off if the mortgage wasn't paid for 4 months. Time flew by and 4 months passed quickly. Then I started receiving a lot of calls from my sister-in-law Tiffany and my mother-in-law Dolores. My call history was filled with their names, and it was getting scary, like something out of a horror movie. They were incredibly persistent, so I finally answered the phone. They were furious because the house was being sold. Apparently, when they tried to return to the house, they found out they couldn't get in because of a seizure notice. Tiffany and her husband had moved out of their apartment since Richard passed away, and Tiffany had also quit her job. I suggested they move back into their parents' house since they were panicking about suddenly being homeless. Surprisingly, Dolores had gotten so caught up in gambling that she couldn't keep up and had sold her own house. It turns out they had been living together for the past 5 months. I also heard that they sold their main source of income, a parking lot in front of the train station, a long time ago. Now Dolores and Tiffany's family are completely homeless. When Dolores said, "I'm sorry for everything. Let's get along. Can you lend me some money, please?" I replied, "I think it's best if you stay away since I'm a jinx. We're strangers now that we've severed ties." Dolores was quiet after mumbling weakly. In my mind, I was thinking, who's the real bad luck charm here? Then when I said I wouldn't lend them a single cent, Tiffany, who had been listening next to Dolores, shouted, "You devil! Bring us the money right now!" "I am a devil and bad luck, so I'm going to hang up now," I replied, and ended the call. In reality, I involved a lawyer for the past 5 months to push for the auction of the house. I thought it was an unusual case, but apparently it's not that uncommon. The house was sold without any major issues, giving our family a moment of peace. We plan to find a new home with the money Richard left us. Since it's just my mother and me now, we don't need a big house. Instead, we're prioritizing security as 2 women living together, so I chose a condominium with minimal noise disturbance. I remember something Richard always said when we were building our home. People can get energy from the sun, so let's create a place where the mother-in-law can enjoy her hobby of reading in the garden without feeling self-conscious. With those words, he had designed a spacious courtyard for her. So now, I looked for a condo with a large balcony where she could enjoy her coffee and read in peace. It's smaller than our previous home, but the space is enough to house our furniture. Richard's choice of land, gifted to us by his grandfather, was expansive, and the house sold for more than expected. With that money, we're moving forward. I recently bought a luxurious condominium with exceptional security features, something I'm sure would have comforted Richard, who was always cautious. The peace of mind that comes from living in such a secure place feels invaluable, especially after the tumultuous experiences with my in-laws. Life has taken a dramatic turn since Richard passed away. Amidst my grief, I've been dealing with the fallout from his family's actions, which has been draining. After the auction of our house, Richard's mother, Marie, and his sister found themselves without a place to live. Despite their desperate attempts, including trying to borrow money from neighbors, they couldn't secure any financial assistance and ended up in public housing. In public housing, they continued their old habits, causing disturbances that have started to concern the community. For example, they recently had a barbecue on their small balcony, an act that left many locals in disbelief. Given the limited space and safety concerns, such thoughtlessness seemed typical of them and reflected the disregard they'd always shown for others' comfort. Moreover, their financial difficulties have led to frequent loud arguments that disrupt the nightly peace, a constant reminder of their ongoing strife. My sister-in-law's husband has since left, leaving just her and Dolores to fend for themselves. Their situation is in stark contrast to the quiet, stable life my mother and I now lead. We're both 2-person households, but while my home has become a sanctuary, theirs is a source of constant conflict and unease. It's become so disruptive that neighbors are banding together, hoping to evict them to restore some semblance of peace. It's a harsh reminder that no matter where you go, being a nuisance can make you unwelcome. Reflecting on these events, I realize how the phrase, "what goes around comes around," rings true. My goal now is to live quietly and peacefully, distanced from the embarrassing turmoil of my former family. I believe Richard watches over us, perhaps with mixed feelings about the chaos his family continues to perpetuate, in contrast to the tranquility he cherished during his life. As I move forward, my focus is on living a life that causes no trouble to others. I want to honor Richard's memory, not just through words, but through actions. He always advocated for a life well lived, surrounded by people who bring joy and understanding. Despite the unfortunate family dynamics he left behind, I'm committed to building a life filled with positivity and peace. The decision to buy this condominium wasn't just about finding a new home, it was about creating a haven where my mother and I could feel safe and secure. The quiet, the order, and the absence of drama allow us to enjoy each other's company, and focus on the things that truly matter. It's smaller than our previous house, but every corner of this new space is cherished, and every moment of silence is savored. I've learned a lot about resilience and moving forward. The memories of Richard, filled with love and laughter, inspire me every day. They remind me of the importance of living authentically and compassionately, ensuring that his spirit of kindness is carried forward. Living well is perhaps the best tribute I can offer to a man who gave so much and asked for so little in return. In this new chapter, amidst the serenity of our chosen sanctuary, I am determined to live not just for myself, but in a way that would make Richard proud. After enduring significant shocks in life, from the hostility and resentment from Richard's family to the irreplaceable loss of him, my mother and I are now left with painful lessons. However, we've also found peace in our decisions, and now it's time to reflect on the events that unfolded to draw valuable lessons. My story truly exemplifies the paradoxes of life and how different people react to the challenges they face. Richard, despite coming from a family lacking love and empathy, remained steadfast in protecting both me and my mother, even when his family kept opposing us. The rude actions of his mother and sister toward me only highlighted a painful truth. They never understood or respected the value of genuine love. It's clear that sometimes the people we love most can be the ones who hurt us the most. But through this journey, I've learned that patience, forgiveness, and the strength to stand firm in the face of adversity are the crucial values that Richard taught me. He always believed that changing others was unnecessary, but changing the way we respond to them is the key. If I could change one thing, I would wish that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law would understand that success, wealth, or power is not what defines a person's worth. Meanwhile, my mother and I will continue living a peaceful life, untouched by meaningless battles. Just as Richard once said, there are some people who will never understand you, and trying to change them is a waste of time. Instead, I choose to live my life honoring what truly matters: love, understanding, and the freedom to be true to myself.
As I stood in the diner, the place where Miles and I fell in love, I couldn't believe the words that tumbled from his mouth. "I'm moving back with my parents. I miss my mother's cooking." That moment, amidst the clatter of dishes, I realized I was just an accessory in his life, not his partner. "I'm Scarlett, and for as long as I can remember, I've been just your average person. I was never the one who turned heads when I walked into a room, nor did I have any talents that set me apart from the crowd. Just your typical girl next door, blending into the background." It wasn't until I was in my late 30s that my uneventful life took an unexpected turn. I met Miles at a small family-run diner located a bit off the town center. This quaint diner was my escape, a place where I could enjoy a quiet meal and feel at ease. Run by an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. King, and their son Miles, it had a charm that drew me back week after week. Initially, I was just another regular customer, often dining alone, observing the comings and goings with a shy smile. Over time, however, I began to open up, chatting with other regulars, sharing stories and laughs. It was in this warm, bustling environment that Miles and I grew closer. Miles was different from anyone I had ever met. He had a gentle demeanor, a kind smile, and a way of making everyone feel special. When he first asked me out, I remember thinking, is he really interested in someone like me? But there was sincerity in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. Our relationship blossomed slowly, nurtured by shared meals and quiet conversations in the diner. "I love your smile, Scarlett," Miles would often say, "and the way you interact with everyone here, it's endearing." These words meant the world to me, someone who had always doubted her own appeal. By the time I turned 33, Miles and I were inseparable. Despite my insecurities about being an old lady, as I often joked, Miles's affection never wavered. He saw something in me that I had struggled to see in myself. When he proposed, I was over the moon. The thought that someone like me, who had always been so ordinary, could find this kind of happiness was like a dream. After our wedding, Miles suggested, "Let's move into a rental apartment together." I was relieved, as the idea of living with his parents, though kind, was daunting to me. They were still strangers after all. But then came the unexpected request from Miles. He wanted me to join the diner staff. "The business needs help," he said. "And who better to assist than a regular who already knows and loves the place?" I was hesitant. "My job in office administration is all I've known," I told him. "The thought of diving into the service industry is intimidating." But Miles's encouragement and my growing attachment to the diner and its patrons swayed me. So I took a leap of faith, quitting my office job to become a part of the world that had brought Miles and me together. Working at the diner was a challenge at first. The long hours, the constant hustle and bustle, and the need to always be on were exhausting. But as I grew into my role, interacting with customers became the highlight of my day. Their warm reception and kind words slowly chipped away at my insecurities. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. However, as much as the diner brought joy to my life, it also brought unforeseen hardships, ones that would soon test the very fabric of my marriage to Miles. Little did I know, the dream I was living was teetering on the edge of a precipice, about to tumble into a reality I had never imagined. Adjusting to married life with Miles brought its own difficulties and surprises. Our small apartment had a honeymoon atmosphere, filled with the promise of shared dreams and a future together. Yet as days turned into weeks, the reality of our new life began to set in. The decision to leave my office job and join the diner wasn't one I took lightly. I've always been a person of habit, comfortable in the routine and predictability of my administrative role. But love has a way of nudging us towards the unexpected. For Miles, I was ready to embrace this new adventure. Working at the diner was like stepping into a different world. The warm, familiar ambiance I cherished as a customer took on a new dimension behind the counter. I was no longer just a spectator, but a part of the lively tapestry that made the diner so special. Mr. and Mrs. King, with their decades of experience, were patient teachers, guiding me through the nuances of running a successful eatery. Their son, my husband, was my biggest supporter, always offering a reassuring smile or a word of encouragement when the pace became overwhelming. I found a sense of accomplishment in my new role, serving customers who quickly turned from strangers into familiar faces. Their smiles and gratitude, which were a balm on my long-standing insecurity, gradually building my confidence. Miles was right. I could do this, and I was doing it well. However, the long hours at the diner began to take their toll. Our days started early and ended late, with barely any time left for ourselves. The routine of waking up, rushing to the diner, and returning home exhausted became our new normal. The little moments of connection that Miles and I once shared were now lost in the hustle of daily life. Cooking at home, once a relaxing activity, became a chore I dreaded. Weary from a day's work, I found myself relying more on supermarket ready-made meals. Miles, who initially didn't mind, gradually began to withdraw. Our conversations dwindled, replaced by a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. I couldn't help but notice the change in him. The man who once looked at me with so much love and admiration now seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts. The warmth we shared seemed to cool, leaving a void I didn't know how to fill. Is it the stress of the diner, or is it something more? I asked myself repeatedly. Something deeper that's drifting us apart? I longed for the days when we could just be Miles and Scarlett, not just co-workers or business partners. But those days seemed like a distant memory, blurred by the relentless demands of the diner and the unspoken tensions growing between us. As I lay in bed each night listening to Miles's steady breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease settling in my heart. Our journey together had started with so much hope and love, but now I found myself questioning where we were headed. Is this the life I had dreamed of? Or have I unknowingly stepped into a future I wasn't prepared for? I wondered in those quiet, reflective moments. I realized that the path ahead was uncertain, and the happiness I once felt was slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. I was at a crossroads, and the choices I made next would determine the course of my life with Miles. As the days turned into months, my life at the diner began to find its rhythm. The initial nervousness that accompanied each interaction with customers faded, replaced by a newfound confidence. I greeted regulars by name, remembered their favorite orders, and shared light-hearted banter that left us all smiling. The diner, with its endless stream of people from all walks of life, became a place where I felt I truly belonged. But this feeling of belonging came at a cost. The long hours started early in the morning and stretched late into the evening. The time I spent at the diner eclipsed almost every other aspect of my life, including my time with Miles. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, dwindled to brief exchanges about mundane things. The emotional distance between us grew with each passing day, forming a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Miles's behavior added to the strain. He became more withdrawn, speaking only when necessary, and often in a curt manner. The warmth and affection that had defined our early relationship seemed to have evaporated, leaving a cold void in its place. I missed the man I fell in love with, the one who saw beauty in my ordinariness, who made me feel special in a way I never had before. At home, our routine became a silent dance of cohabitation. We moved around each other with a practiced indifference, each absorbed in our own fatigue and thoughts. The meals I prepared, once a source of pride, now felt like an obligation. Miles's apparent lack of interest in anything beyond the diner made me question my place in his life. Am I just a convenient addition to the business, or does he still see me as his partner, his confidant, his love? I wondered. The thought that our marriage might be unraveling was a bitter pill to swallow. I had invested so much of myself into this relationship, into this new life, that the idea of it all being for nothing was too painful to consider. As the days turned into weeks, the signs of our relationship disintegrating became harder and harder to ignore. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the diner, I mustered the courage to address the elephant in the room. "Miles, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone flat. "I feel like we're drifting apart," I began, my voice trembling. "We barely talk anymore, and when we do, it feels like we're just going through the motions. I miss us, Miles. I miss what we had," I added. "I'm just tired, Scarlett," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. "Running the diner takes a lot out of me. I don't have the energy for anything else." That night, as I lay in bed, a sense of despair washed over me. My marriage, once a source of joy and companionship, had become a lonely and unfulfilling existence. The diner, which I had embraced as a new beginning, now felt like a trap, binding me to a life that was slowly suffocating me. As I closed my eyes, trying to escape the reality of my situation, I couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. Where had the love and connection gone? And more importantly, is there any way to get them back, or have we passed the point of no return? The months rolled on, and the strain of working at the diner, coupled with the growing distance between Miles and me, began to take a visible toll. I started each day with a forced smile, clinging to the hope that things would improve, but deep down, I felt a growing sense of despair. The shift in dynamics at the diner became more pronounced. Mr. and Mrs. King, once warm and appreciative of my efforts, started to treat me more like an employee than a family member. Their remarks, once encouraging, turned critical, often pointing out small mistakes or ways I could improve. It felt as if they were scrutinizing my every move, waiting for me to slip up. Miles's behavior continued to perplex me. Our interactions became more functional and less personal. He spoke to me mostly about work-related matters, and even then, his tone was often brusque and dismissive. The gentle, caring man I had married seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone who was perpetually tired and irritable. The diner, once my refuge and source of joy, started to feel like a prison. Each day blended into the next, a monotonous cycle of serving customers, cleaning up, and trying to meet the ever-increasing expectations of the Kings. I began to dread going to work, feeling a sense of heaviness in my chest each morning as I prepared for another long day. At home, things were no better. Miles and I moved around each other like strangers, our conversations limited to the bare essentials. The apartment, once filled with laughter and love, now echoed with silence. I missed the intimacy and connection we once shared, but it seemed like a distant memory, lost amidst the chaos and stress of our daily lives. I started to question everything about our relationship. Had I been so blinded by love that I failed to see the true nature of the man I married? Was our marriage built on a foundation of mutual respect and affection? Or was it merely a convenient arrangement for Miles and his family? These thoughts haunted me, eroding the last vestiges of hope I held for our marriage. I felt trapped in a life that was no longer mine, bound by obligations and expectations that I no longer understood. The joy and happiness that once defined my relationship with Miles had evaporated, leaving behind a void filled with doubt, confusion, and loneliness. As I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, I realized that I had to make a choice. I could continue to endure this life, hoping against hope that things would change, or I could take a stand and reclaim my independence. The thought of leaving was terrifying, but the thought of staying in a loveless marriage was even more so. I knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but I also knew that I deserved more than what my life had become. I deserved to be loved, to be valued, and to be happy. And so, with a heavy heart and a resolve that surprised even me, I began to plan my escape from the life I had once so eagerly embraced. In the following weeks, my resolve to change my situation grew stronger. On the surface, I maintained the facade of the diligent wife and dedicated diner employee. But internally, I was planning my departure from this life that had become so constrictive and unfulfilling. The diner's atmosphere had grown increasingly toxic. Mr. and Mrs. King's criticisms became more frequent and harsh, often leaving me feeling deflated and worthless. It seemed like no matter how hard I tried, it was never good enough for them. I started to feel like an outsider in a place that once felt like home. Miles's indifference to my plight only added to my sense of isolation. He was so engrossed in the diner that he seemed oblivious to the changes in me and the deteriorating state of our marriage. Our home life had become a silent coexistence, with neither of us willing to address the growing chasm between us. My 34th birthday passed without acknowledgement from Miles or his parents. It was a stark reminder of how much things had changed. On that day, I made a silent vow to myself. I would not allow my spirit to be crushed by this loveless marriage and thankless job. The turning point came unexpectedly one evening when Miles announced that he planned to move back in with his parents. The reason was simple yet unexpected. He missed his mother's cooking. That statement, delivered so matter-of-factly, was a clear indication of where his priorities lay. I was taken aback by the sheer audacity of his decision, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. It was as if the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, confirming my suspicions that I was nothing more than an accessory in Miles's life. With Miles's departure, the apartment felt emptier, but it also provided me with the space to breathe and think clearly about my next steps. I continued to work at the diner, enduring the King's coldness and the grueling routine, all while planning my exit. As I served the customers, many of whom I had come to know well, I wondered if they noticed the change in me. Their kind words and smiles were a bittersweet reminder of what the diner used to represent, a place of warmth and community. But now it was just a reminder of everything I had lost. I realized that my departure from the diner would not only be a statement of my independence, but also a reclaiming of my self-worth. I was no longer willing to be treated as an afterthought, to have my efforts and my presence devalued. So I bided my time, waiting for the right moment to make my move. The days were long, and the work was exhausting, but the thought of starting a new chapter, free from the shackles of my current life, gave me the strength to endure. My decision to leave the diner, and consequently, my marriage, was not an impulsive one. It was the culmination of months of silent endurance, of swallowing my pride and biting back tears. I had reached my breaking point, and there was no turning back. I remember the day I finally mustered the courage to act. It was a busy lunch hour at the diner, and amidst the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversations, I felt a sense of calm resolve. As I moved between the tables, serving customers with a smile that had become all too mechanical, I knew that it was the last time I would be doing this. After the lunch rush, I approached Mr. and Mrs. King, my heart pounding in my chest. "I need to talk to you both," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. They looked at me, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. "What's on your mind?" Mr. King asked. "I've decided to leave the diner," I announced, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying. "This will be my last week." Their reactions were a mix of disbelief and anger. "You can't just leave us like this," Mrs. King exclaimed, her voice sharp. "We depend on you." "I'm sorry," I replied, the apology feeling hollow, "but I need to do what's best for me." The rest of the week was a blur of cold shoulders and whispered conversations. I could feel the King's resentment towards me, but it no longer had the power to hurt me. I was finally breaking free. Miles's reaction to my decision was one of confusion and frustration. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice tinged with a hint of desperation. "We need you here." "I'm not happy here, Miles," I said, the truth of the words ringing clear and loud. "I haven't been happy for a long time." My departure from the diner caused quite a stir among the regular customers, many of whom had become friends. People who had seen me grow from a shy, uncertain woman into someone with confidence and a sense of self. Their words of support and encouragement were a balm to my wounded heart. Leaving the diner for the last time, I felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness for the end of a chapter in my life, but also a profound sense of relief and anticipation for what lay ahead. I was stepping into the unknown, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. The next step was to confront the reality of my failing marriage. It was a daunting prospect, but I knew it was necessary. The love and respect that should have been the foundation of our relationship had eroded, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. I met with Miles one last time in the now empty apartment that once housed our dreams and plans for the future. "I want a divorce," I said, the words slicing through the tense silence. Miles looked at me, his expression a mix of shock and resignation. "Is this really what you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied, my decision unwavering. "It's what I need." And so I walked away from the life I had built with Miles and from the diner that had once been my sanctuary. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but also the most empowering. I was no longer the unsure, self-doubting woman who had walked into that diner all those years ago. I was Scarlett, strong, independent, and ready to face whatever the future held. The days following my departure from the diner and my separation from Miles were a whirlwind of emotions. There was an overwhelming sense of freedom, tinged with a bittersweet nostalgia for what had once been. I was starting over, building a new life from the ashes of my old one. The process of divorcing Miles was surprisingly straightforward. Perhaps he too had come to realize that our paths had diverged irrevocably. We parted ways with a sense of mutual resignation, a silent acknowledgement of the love that had once bound us, but was no longer enough to keep us together. In the aftermath of my departure, I heard through mutual acquaintances that the diner struggled without me. Many of the regulars who had become my friends and supporters stopped frequenting the place. It was a stark reminder of how interconnected our lives had been, and how my presence had become a part of the diner's identity. The news stirred a complex mix of emotions in me. There was no joy in knowing the difficulties they faced. It was a sad epilogue to a chapter of my life that had started with so much hope and enthusiasm, yet it affirmed my decision to leave, to seek a life where I was valued and respected. I moved into a small but cozy apartment, a space that was entirely my own. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my surroundings and my destiny. The solitude gave me the opportunity to reflect, to understand the journey I had been on, and to envision the path I wanted to take moving forward. I found a new job in office administration, returning to a field where I had once thrived. The familiarity of the work was comforting, but I approached it with a new perspective, enriched by my experiences at the diner. My interactions with colleagues and clients were infused with the confidence and people skills I had developed in those challenging years. The freedom to make my own choices, to live life on my terms, was exhilarating. I rediscovered old hobbies and explored new interests, building a life that was not only fulfilling, but also authentically mine. As I settled into my new routine, I realized that the challenges I had faced had not broken me. They had strengthened me. I had learned to stand up for myself, to assert my worth, and to pursue happiness even, when it meant walking away from what was familiar and comfortable. I forged new friendships, nurtured old ones, and opened myself up to the possibility of love again. The scars of my past were still there, but they no longer defined me. They were a testament to my resilience, to my ability to rise from adversity. Looking back, I realized that the diner, Miles, and the life I had left behind were all integral parts of my journey. They had shaped me in ways I could never have imagined, leading me to this moment where I stood strong and unafraid, ready to embrace whatever the future held. As I gazed out of the window of my new apartment, the world outside seemed bright and full of possibilities. I was Scarlett, no longer just a character in someone else's story, but the author of my own, and this was just the beginning. I have been married for 3 years, living with my husband and our kitten, Milo. My mother-in-law is convinced that academic background is everything. She takes great pride in the fact that her son graduated from a prestigious university. We live in the countryside where there is only one convenience store, so we have a close relationship with our neighbors. During conversations with the neighbors, my mother-in-law always boasts about her son, saying, "You can't marry someone like him unless you have an impressive educational background yourself." When we first met during the meeting with the parents, she asked me right away, "Which university did you graduate from?" "I graduated from the University of Arizona," I replied. When she heard the name of my university, she made a clearly disapproving face. She didn't know the name and assumed it was a third-rate establishment. I couldn't shake the feeling that she thought I was a graduate of a low-ranking university. Even though she approved of our marriage, she began to abuse me in everyday life. Whenever my husband and father-in-law were not around, she would approach me and say, "Why did Kyrie end up with such a low-educated wife? You can't compare to my highly educated son. You probably forced him into marriage with some unwanted pregnancy or by exploiting his weaknesses. It's awful for any child to have a mother like you. It's better not to be born at all." She would utter these words every time we met personally. We weren't living together at the time, but whenever I had free time, she would constantly comment on my lack of education. She seemed pleased when I felt frustrated and my hair was turning gray. Then the mother-in-law took her complaints all over the neighborhood. She used to say things like, "Linda can't even do basic math and can only say the alphabet at her age." Because of that, it wasn't uncommon for me to be left out by the residents. I thought about leaving many times, but I knew if I did, my mother-in-law would accuse me of deserting her and spread false rumors to the neighbors. So I endured without telling anyone about the harassment I was facing. One day after living like this for a while, my in-laws decided to rebuild their house since my father-in-law had developed health problems. They renovated the house to make it more comfortable. Since we were taking care of my father-in-law the whole time, we decided to take care of all the expenses. My mother-in-law suggested throwing a big celebration and inviting the neighbors. Naturally, I ended up being responsible for the preparations. "I'll help," my husband offered, but my mother-in-law quickly took his hand, saying, "Kyrie, come with me. I would like to introduce my highly educated son to everyone." Then she turned to me, stating, "You, with your low education, your only specialty is cooking, so hurry up and get the preparation done." That was her final remark before she left. My mother-in-law was ecstatic. As expected, she started boasting, putting together the people. "My son built his house as well. He is truly a success, a magical son. I wonder who raised such a child. Oh, right, it's me. Ha ha," she said cheerfully. One of the neighborhood ladies expressed envy, which further fueled my mother-in-law, prompting her to continue. On the other hand, my daughter-in-law is eager to take over this house without contributing a single dollar. She has no intention of giving me a precious grandchild. She is truly a wicked woman, my mother-in-law said, directing her spiteful gaze toward me. "Look at this," she continued. "This is why having an uneducated daughter-in-law is troublesome. She will never have children and is greedy for money. She must be plotting to inherit our assets. Are you adding something suspicious to today's meal? Everyone should avoid eating it," she added, criticizing the dish I had prepared. Unfortunately, I didn't add anything suspicious. Besides, my mother-in-law tasted my cooking. Even if I had added something, she probably would have tolerated it without a problem. "Well, we can't expect much from Linda's child. It will have the genus of low education mixed in." She said it in a hushed voice, smirking. She made sure it was out of earshot from my husband and father-in-law. My mother-in-law always harasses me without being caught by others. That aspect of her infuriates me even more. The neighborhood ladies echoed my mother-in-law's sentiments. That's right, they laughed and agreed. When I gave a slight glare at those friends of my mother-in-law, they awkwardly averted their gaze. If you feel bad about it, then don't align yourself with her. After all, my mother-in-law is not some proper figure, or perhaps she has some leverage over them, I thought. While I was contemplating such thoughts as my mother-in-law's insults towards me didn't cease, how long will this kind of life continue? Do I have to endure being bullied by my mother-in-law for the rest of my life? For what purpose? Lost in my thoughts, a few minutes later, I arrived at a certain conclusion. I've had enough of this, I suddenly shouted, startling my mother-in-law and the little kitten. Milo, I'm sorry for scaring you. I'll give you some treats later, okay? To my mother-in-law, I said, you don't like me, do you, mother-in-law? You don't want a child from someone like me with low education, right? And who knows what would happen if I had a child? Would they be abandoned in the mountains? Oh, it's scary. Scary, I concluded. What? I would never do such a thing, my mother-in-law objected. Also, mother-in-law, regarding the money I contributed to building this house, I have decided that you will repay me the full amount without fail, I informed her. My words left her flustered. What nonsense are you talking about? My mother-in-law's voice echoed throughout the house, catching the attention of my husband and father-in-law, who promptly joined us. Since the people around us were also showing curiosity and staring at us, I decided to truly rebel against my mother-in-law. Perfect. It's a great opportunity to expose her wickedness, isn't it? I thought. What was that loud noise just now? My husband asked anxiously. Listen, my mother-in-law snapped. This woman here has the audacity to demand the repayment for the money used to build this house, even though she didn't contribute a single dime. Everyone's gaze immediately turned toward me. But mother-in-law, didn't you say you don't want a child from me? I asked. That's right, to our neighbors, right? I asked the neighbor who was nearby. Yeah, that's true. She always that, she replied. Yeah, we don't need the genes from someone with low education, the neighbor continued, perplexed by my question. To my surprise, my mother-in-law stood there with her mouth wide open, shocked. She must have thought these women would never betray her. How pathetic. Why should I silently endure being belittled just because of that? I'm not your stress relief tool. I am not, I objected. I turned back to my mother-in-law and said angrily, how could you say something like that about me? My husband and father-in-law, upon learning this truth, expressed their astonishment. Are you bullying Linda? Are you kidding me? My father-in-law approached my mother-in-law, his face turning red. Overwhelmed by his unusual anger, she tried to argue back. It's true. There's nothing wrong with saying that a child from the low-educated Linda wouldn't amount to anything. Besides, she is just a stay-at-home wife relying on our son. Who does she think she is? I didn't say anything wrong, she shouted, but noticing the cold glares from my husband and father-in-law, her face turned pale. Yes, my mother-in-law had always acted like a good mother-in-law in front of my husband and father-in-law. My husband cast a cold gaze aside and said to his mother, Mom, what are you saying? Linda graduated from Harvard, you know. She's much smarter than me. The room fell silent all at once. Huh? What do you mean? My mother-in-law was perplexed. The name of some unknown third-grade university is what Linda told me before you got married. My mother-in-law was in a panic. However, I did graduate from Harvard University. The name of the unknown third-grade university that my mother-in-law had heard was Cambridge University. It's a globally famous university that even people who aren't familiar with universities would know. After graduating from college, I studied abroad in the UK and completed my master's degree, which became my highest educational qualification. When my mother-in-law asked me about my alma mater, I simply mentioned the name of the university without thinking too much about it. Little did I expect that she would misunderstand and subject me to such relentless harassment. If my mother-in-law, who values educational background and graduated from the University of Arizona and was knowledgeable about universities, she would surely know about Cambridge University, ranked 5th in the world. But due to this misunderstanding, things had escalated to this point. However, I had no intention of correcting her now. I had already decided that I had no intention of maintaining a long-term relationship with such a meddling mother-in-law. Besides, a person's character is not determined by their educational background. My own parents didn't even attend college, yet they are people I greatly respect. That's why I hadn't planned on discussing educational background, but this may have been a good opportunity after all. My husband got angry with his mother because of my actions. Hey, the fund for this house comes from Linda's savings. She contributed $100,000. How dare you underestimate Linda? A full-time housewife like Linda can't possibly have that kind of money, my mother-in-law retorted. Linda is not a housewife. In fact, she earns several times more than me, my husband added. What? My mother-in-law exclaimed in surprise. Yes, I support myself by stock trading and make over $10,000 in profit a month. Of course, I've never told my mother-in-law about it, so it's understandable that she would think that way. The reason I haven't told her is that just like her emphasis on educational background, my mother-in-law loved money. If she found out about my earnings, she would undoubtedly start demanding luxury cars and the greatest home appliances. That's why I asked my husband to keep it a secret from his mother. In reality, no matter when she called or suddenly dropped by, she assumed I'm just a typical housewife type because I'm always here. When confronted with the truth, my mother-in-law seemed unable to find any words and remained completely stunned. Now let me address something that I'm sure many of you are wondering about. It's why I contributed to the house funds for my despised mother-in-law. Normally, one wouldn't want to spend even a single dollar for that. It was to prevent the topic of us living together from coming up. I thought if I provided a beautiful barrier-free home, she'd stay quiet even if her health deteriorated a bit. Besides, since she would be comfortable in her home, I believed she wouldn't come over frequently in the future. It was an expense for me to live peacefully. Don't you think it's a small price to pay? However, after this incident, I could only perceive my mother-in-law as an enemy. Anyway, you'll repay the full $100,000. If you can't, then sell the land and the house. If you don't like that, then borrow money from a financial institution, I stated firmly. You can't be allowed to do that. This house belongs to us now, so I have no intention of giving her even a single dollar. My mother-in-law panicked. The father-in-law, who had been lost in thought until then, finally yelled at the mother-in-law. How much more do you need to make everyone around you miserable? He finally yelled at his wife, exasperated. Look around. Nobody is on your side. The mother-in-law was shouted at by her husband and started crying. Still, no matter how much my father-in-law apologized, she refused to lift her head. She had an extraordinary amount of pride. In the end, my mother-in-law never apologized and left without even looking at me. Linda, I'm sorry. I should have been paying attention. This shouldn't have happened. My father-in-law apologized sincerely to me. There's no need for my father-in-law to apologize. I reassured him, placing my hand on his shoulder. My mother-in-law only bullies me when he's not around. Father-in-law, you've done nothing wrong. Please continue treating me like your own daughter from now on, I tried to reassure. Thank you, Linda, my father-in-law said gratefully. Leave it to me. I'll make sure she never plays you again. With that, my father-in-law followed after my mother-in-law. The people around us seemed relieved that the situation had settled down. Neighborhood residents came to apologize to me and even declared that they used to cut ties with my mother-in-law. My heart felt light and at ease. 1 month later, it seems my father-in-law has announced a divorce to my mother-in-law. Apparently, it wasn't just about that day. She had been having an affair with a highly educated middle-aged man. My father-in-law suspected something was amiss and secretly hired a private investigator to look into it. The divorce was quickly finalized, and it turns out my mother-in-law has to pay back the $100,000 renovation costs that I had covered. The renovation expenses were reimbursed by her affair partner. In turn, she's currently working as a housekeeper for him. My father-in-law reported this to us with a look of relief. From now on, both my husband and I can live without being troubled by my mother-in-law. As for me, I'm now 5 months pregnant, and my husband, father-in-law, and even the neighbors are concerned about my well-being and have offered their help. I feel great relief. I can't help but feel a slight sense of gratitude toward my mother-in-law. It's thanks to her that I regained so many allies. Looking ahead, I hope to live happily with our soon-to-be-born child, my husband, father-in-law, and our cat Milo. I cared for her for 5 years, but my mother... Sobs were heard from the audience and tears welled up in my husband's eyes. He's done nothing for all this time, yet he plays the good son so well. I'm the only one who knows the truth. You better realize this, William, I started, playing the audio evidence that would reveal my husband's true nature. My name is Isabel. I've been married to my husband, William, for 7 years now. Currently, we live as a family of 3 with my bedridden mother-in-law. 5 years ago, she was forced into a bedridden lifestyle due to her illness. My father-in-law passed away before I got married, so there's no one else to take care of my mother-in-law. Around the same time, my husband's work wasn't going well, and we were having a tough time making ends meet. So my husband asked, "Could we live together with you?" And my mother-in-law agreed. Feeling guilty for depending on her so much, I decided to take care of her while also working part-time. On the other hand, my mother-in-law seemed to feel guilty about being cared for. "Isabel, that's enough. Please don't worry about me." She always talked about it with a concerned smile. I always encourage her with a strong will. "What are you talking about? I'm indebted to you, mother-in-law." "But it must be hard, with both work and housework, plus taking care of me." "I don't want to burden you anymore, Isabel," mother-in-law said. "It's not a burden at all. I want to be with you. That's why I'm doing this of my own accord," I added. "But you should have your own happiness," she uttered. "Being able to talk to you every day like this is my happiness. So don't worry about it," I concluded. Tears welled up in my mother-in-law's eyes as she whispered a small "thank you." There's not much that I can do, yet she always expresses her gratitude like this. Ever since we got married, my mother-in-law has been very kind to me, so taking care of her is not a burden at all. In fact, it feels like my mission. While I do enjoy caring for her, there's one thing I'm not satisfied with in my current life. That dissatisfaction is with my husband, William. He's what you'd call a traditional type who thinks housework is a woman's job. He wasn't that bad when we got married, but since we started living with his parents, he's become increasingly selfish. He doesn't contribute much to the household expenses, but his attitude is as high as Everest. For instance, when he comes home, he starts yelling if I don't greet him at the door. "Hey, Isabel, I'm home. Why aren't you greeting me? Hurry up, get my stuff." "Welcome home." I frowned at my husband and voiced my complaints. "Listen, William, I've told you before, I'm not your servant, so you should do what you can on your own." "Huh, what are you saying? Who do you think is making the money for this family?" he asked with a smirk. "Yes, it's true that you're providing for us, but I'm also doing my part," I replied. "Doing your part? All you do is clean the house and chat with my mom," he uttered. "I'm also working part-time. You know that, right? Despite that, you speak to me like this," I resented. "Shut up. Your earnings are just peanuts. You can't survive without me, so don't you dare defy me," he indignantly declared. "And you can't even contribute properly to the living expenses. The only reason we can live in this house is, undoubtedly, thanks to your mother." I defended myself. At first, I would fight back, but my husband started threatening divorce every time we quarreled. "Watch yourself, Isabel. Keep this up and we'll get a divorce, got it?" he threatened. "Please, not so loud. Your mother is in the other room," I asked. "Shut it. It's all because you're so insolent. Understand this. You'd be the one in trouble if we divorced. Do you get that?" he kept yelling. "Just lower your voice and don't always talk about divorce like that," I begged. "Yeah, right. You would have nowhere to go if we got divorced. Besides, there's no company out there willing to hire a screw-up like you full-time, Isabel," he added. "Stop talking like that," I started. "Just shut up and listen to what I'm saying, you idiot. You're so slow," he interrupted. Honestly, I was more than ready to divorce my husband, but when I thought of my mother-in-law, I couldn't bring myself to go through with it. "You can always talk to me if you're troubled, Isabel. You're my precious daughter," she was saying. My mother-in-law was always very kind to me, as if we were truly mother and daughter. Because of her, I wanted to take care of her properly until the end. I wanted to repay her for all the kindness she had shown me. That's why I endured the painful days with my husband in this house. I couldn't entrust my mother-in-law's care to a man like him. Then one day, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the usual shouting from the entrance. "Hey, Isabel, I'm home. Come out and greet me." "I'm using the stove right now and can't leave it," I replied. "What? Are you kidding me? What kind of wife doesn't prioritize her husband? My husband, losing patience, stormed into the kitchen. Hey, what are you thinking? I always tell you to greet me when I come home. Why don't you understand? As you can see, I was just frying something, I uttered. I don't care. You should have timed it to be finished when I come home. You're useless. He was angry. Well, you never tell me when you'll be home, I objected. I told you not to talk back. A useless and insolent wife is nothing but garbage. My husband was boiling. My mother-in-law, who had come out upon hearing the harsh words, spoke in a stern voice. William, that is no way to talk, is it? Oh, Mom, you're still alive? He asked sarcastically. Isabel is working hard every day for this household, for both you and me, mother-in-law added. That's what a wife is supposed to do, right? She earns a little, is half-baked in housekeeping. She's basically social trash, my husband continued. Enough is enough. My usually quiet mother-in-law raised her voice on the spot. You will not say what you want about her. Don't you dare slander Isabel. What? Mom, are you on Isabel's side too? You two are colluding, huh? My husband was perplexed. My mother-in-law, who usually remains silent, continued to speak this time. William, one request. Huh, what is it? He sagged. Just put me in a nursing home. I don't want to be a burden on Isabel anymore, she continued. Huh, a nursing home. Where do you think we have that kind of money? He said in surprise. You still have your father's inheritance and my pension. I don't need a fancy place, my mother-in-law's added. At my mother-in-law's unexpected remark, I was at a loss for words. Mother-in-law, have you been considering this? Thinking about me? Tears welled up in my eyes at the thought of her kindness. However, it was completely lost on my husband. At the suggestion, he made a deeply disgusted face. Don't joke around. There's no way we're putting you in a nursing home. That's a waste of money, he protested. Please don't say that. Life would be easier in this house if I wasn't here, my mother-in-law said. If we put you in a facility, the neighbors and my colleagues will start gossiping that I'm an ungrateful son, won't they? My husband continued. You don't need to worry about what people think. I just don't want to be a burden to you, my mother-in-law replied. Then shut up and do as you're told, old woman. I'm taking care of you. Isn't that enough? He said angrily. William, you don't do anything, mother-in-law continued. Huh? I let you live in this house and I make Isabel work too. Isn't that enough for you, ungrateful woman? He wouldn't stop raging. Unable to bear my husband's words, I raised my voice. Are you talking about who's the ungrateful one here? This house is originally your mother's, isn't it? I tried to contradict him. Are you talking back to me again? William looked at me angrily. But that's true, isn't it? 5 years ago when you were fired, we were in trouble, and didn't mother-in-law gladly take us in? How can you say that? I insisted. Ah, shut up, both of you. My husband wouldn't calm down. And I'm not doing this reluctantly. I'm taking care of mother-in-law out of my own will. Stop making unilateral decisions, I said. Despite my desperate plea, my husband just said, That's too troublesome, and left the room. In the awkward silence, my mother-in-law kept apologizing and crying. It's not your fault, mother-in-law. The one at fault is William, I reassured. Every day I was frustrated by a reality that I could not control. A few days later, while I was cleaning the house, a man who claimed to be an acquaintance of my mother-in-law's came to visit. Mother-in-law looked surprised but wore a full smile. Oh, is that you, Leonardo? You came to visit. Well, if I was asked to visit my senior, Catherine, I couldn't refuse, could I? He said. I remember training you a lot at work when we were younger, right? My mother-in-law replied. Yes, I'm grateful. So what's your will? Why did you call me today? Leonardo asked. Yes, actually. Looking at me, mother-in-law said, Sorry, could you step out for a bit? Figuring they had a lot to discuss, I happily agreed, saying sure, and went out to buy some sweets. This man, Leonardo, apparently was a junior when mother-in-law was working. It had been a while since I saw mother-in-law looking so happy. When I returned, Leonardo was just about to leave. Oh, excuse me, I'm about to make tea, I said. No, that's fine. We finished our conversation. But thank you for always taking care of Catherine. She's a benefactor to me, so it's reassuring to know that she has a daughter like you, he uttered. He bowed his head to me and left. From then on, Leonardo visited his mother-in-law regularly, and they always had a lively conversation. It was a few months later that my mother-in-law's condition worsened, and she had to be rushed to the hospital. When I urgently called my husband, he responded with disbelief. My mom's in danger. Ha, as if I care. You're there, you can handle it, he said. But the doctor said her condition's unpredictable. Please, I need you, I pleaded. Ah, no way. Plus I'm leaving for a business trip today, he replied dismissively. What? Now of all times? Please try to cancel it, I begged. Are you stupid? There's no way I can do that. Handle it on your own and don't call me until I reach out first, he snapped and hung up abruptly. Not knowing what to do, I slumped down in front of my mother-in-law's hospital room. He's going on a business trip while his mother is in this state? This is just too cruel. How am I supposed to tell my mother-in-law? I muttered to myself. Just as I was sinking into despair, Leonardo appeared. Oh, Isabel, what's wrong? Leonardo asked. Leonardo, I exclaimed when I saw him. Something happened, right? Let's go to your mother-in-law's room for now, he suggested. Okay, I agreed. When we entered the room, my mother-in-law looked at us and struggled to speak. Leonardo, you're here. So does that mean you did what I asked? Yeah, but are you sure about this? Leonardo replied. Of course. I have to clear things up before I go, don't I? She said weakly. I understand, he nodded. Then my mother-in-law weakly took my hand. Isabel, there's something I want you to know, she uttered. What is it? I asked. My son has been withdrawing money from my account for his pension and spending it on his mistress, she revealed. An affair? I said, shocked. I started to realize it when he started treating me like a servant. But for him to take money from his mother's pension... I asked Leonardo to investigate the matter, she explained. I see. So that's why my mother-in-law called Leonardo to the house, I realized. Leonardo, please record what I'm about to say. It will be my last will, she instructed. Understood, Catherine, Leonardo responded, slowly taking out a voice recorder. Once he finished recording everything, he placed it in my hand. How you use this recording is up to you, Isabel, my mother-in-law said. Yes, I'm the only one who can avenge my mother-in-law, I squeezing her frail hand back with strength. The next day my mother-in-law passed away, leaving her final revenge in my hands. On the day of the funeral, 2 days later, my mother-in-law had always been popular, and a large crowd gathered. Seeing this, my husband commented inappropriately, Wow, I didn't expect so many people to come. It's a great opportunity to show off my skills as a chief mourner. What are you talking about? You weren't even there when she died, I snapped. Ignoring my reproach, he continued casually. I'll make everyone cry with my touching eulogy. My bosses from work are here too. If they're moved by how filial I am, it could boost my reputation and lead to a promotion. Just kidding. How can you act like this when your mother just passed away? I demanded. Just think about it. Now that mom's gone, I'll get dad's inheritance, right? Man, I'm so lucky, he said, ignoring my trembling rage. My husband cheerfully went on to give the eulogy. After the formalities, he began talking about taking care of his mother. Then, with tears in his eyes, he said, I have devoted myself to caring for my mother for 5 years, but in vain she has passed away. But I have no regrets. I am proud that I could support my mother until the end. At my husband's eulogy, sobs could be heard from the audience. Perhaps pleased with the reaction, my husband continued to speak indefinitely with a touch of drama, as if he had always been a dutiful son. The attendees, oblivious, listened to his story with tears in their eyes. Thank you all for today, he concluded. With his closing words, I stood up. As the room began to stir, I stood before my husband and took out a voice recorder. What are you doing? He demanded. Ignoring my husband's words, I raised my voice, addressing those present. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, please listen to this recording. As I pressed the play button, my mother-in-law's voice flowed from the voice recorder. It was her voice at that time, recorded in the hospital. Thank you all for attending today for me. There is something I absolutely want you to hear, so I've left this voice message, she began. My husband, of course, and even the attendees were stunned by the unexpected turn of events. I believe you've just heard my son's speech. Probably he was talking as if he had been a dutiful son. It was a typical speech for my mother-in-law, who knew my boastful husband well. She had a good idea of his possible behavior as a guardian. I increased the volume of the voice recorder so that everyone could hear. However, my son did not do any care for me and just kept shouting at me and my daughter-in-law, Isabel. Of course, we have audio evidence of him verbally abusing Isabel and me. As my husband's face turned red, he shouted, "What is this? Stop this!" Ignoring him, I continued to play the recording. Besides, my son was withdrawing my pension from my account without my permission and giving it to another woman, not Isabel. One day I noticed something odd about my son and had an old friend look into it, and this fact came to light. The attendees were all filled with anger while my husband turned pale. Finally, my mother-in-law delivered a final blow to my husband from heaven. "I have a request for everyone. Please do not give my inheritance to my son. You can donate it, destroy it, whatever. Anyway, I will not forgive my son. I need your help, please." With those words, the voice ceased. My husband was in a panic, shouting something, but no one was there to help him. On the contrary, all of the attendees were giving him cold stares. Looking down at my husband, I said coldly, "Do you understand? This is the result of what you've been doing. You abandoned the care of your mother and were having an affair. You've learned a lot from this, haven't you?" I asked. "Wait, Isabel, I was wrong," he pleaded. "So, you are not going to say something stupid like, 'Help me,' are you? Let me tell you, I will never forgive you. After tormenting your mother and ridiculing people, there's no one who's going to help you. Suffer in hell," I concluded. In the midst of the attendees' cold stares, my husband collapsed onto the ground, pale-faced. After that, I divorced my husband. There was no reason for me to be with him now that my mother-in-law had passed away. I later heard that he had been fired from his job. His boss had been at the funeral, so it was a predictable outcome. I demanded alimony from my ex-husband and his mistress. Apparently his mistress was furious about this and promptly dumped him. A few months later, my ex-husband was able to find a new job through Leonardo's introduction, but that was also part of my mother-in-law's plan. My ex-husband was working at a company known to Leonardo, and from his salary, he was paying me the alimony. Thanks to this, the alimony is paid to me every month without fail. Meanwhile, I started living alone with the money my mother-in-law had left me. Leonardo, who was worried about me, even got me a full-time job. All of this was apparently in my mother-in-law's will. I can't thank my mother-in-law enough for everything she's done for me. I said a prayer in front of my mother-in-law's grave and thanked her in my heart. "Thank you so much, mother-in-law. I swore to myself that I would cherish this life I was given, thanks to my mother-in-law." I'm Ruby, just an ordinary woman who found herself in an extraordinary situation. My life was pretty normal until I met Dylan. We bumped into each other at a charity event held in our town. He was there volunteering, and I was representing my company. It was one of those casual meet-cutes you hear about but never really believe will happen to you. "Sorry I didn't see you there," Dylan apologized after accidentally spilling some coffee on my notes. "It's okay, accidents happen," I replied, trying to salvage what was left of my papers. We struck up a conversation, and I quickly realized that Dylan was a pretty great guy. He was good-looking, sure, but it was more than that. He was kind, talked passionately about helping others, and had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. We exchanged numbers, and before I knew it, we were going on dates, talking for hours, and sharing parts of our lives. Dylan often talked about his family, especially his mom, Clara. He said she had given up her career to raise him, and he admired her a lot for that. According to him, Clara was a caring mom who had always put him first. He spoke of her struggles, particularly her heart condition, which she'd been battling for years. It was clear that Dylan cared deeply for her, and I admired that. A few months into our relationship, Dylan introduced me to Clara. We met at her house for dinner. She was polite, asked me a lot of questions about my job, my family, and my background. She was quite frail, and throughout the evening she mentioned her heart condition several times, how it limited her and made her dependent on Dylan. I felt sorry for her living with such a health issue. "Ruby dear, it's so lovely to meet you. Dylan hasn't stopped talking about you," Clara said with a smile that seemed genuine. "It's nice to meet you too, Mrs. Adams. Dylan speaks very highly of you," I replied, trying to make a good impression. We continued to see each other, and Dylan and I grew closer, but that dinner was the first time I met Clara, the woman who would later turn my world upside down. At that moment, though, I had no idea what was coming. I was just happy to be with Dylan and to be welcomed by his family. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would completely change my life. The wedding came faster than I had expected. Dylan proposed, and I said yes without a second thought. We planned a simple yet elegant wedding. It was one of those perfect days. Clear skies, friends and family gathered, and a sense of joy in the air. I remember thinking as I walked down the aisle, this is it, the beginning of a beautiful life with Dylan. The ceremony was beautiful, and the reception was a blast. We danced, laughed, and celebrated our love. Dylan looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I felt so lucky. However, just a few weeks after our honeymoon, things took an unexpected turn. Clara's health supposedly took a downturn, and Dylan was beside himself with worry. Ruby, my mom's doctor said her heart condition is getting worse. She needs someone with her all the time. I don't know what to do, Dylan told me one evening, looking genuinely distressed. We'll figure it out, Dylan. Maybe we can get a nurse to help her, I suggested, trying to find a solution. Dylan sighed. She refuses. She says she doesn't want a stranger taking care of her. She feels comfortable only with me. I could see the weight of the situation on Dylan's shoulders. After a lengthy discussion, we decided that Clara would move in with us temporarily. I thought, how bad could it be? It was his mother after all. I wanted to be supportive. But soon, I began to notice changes around our home. It started with small things. Clara would move a vase to a different spot or rearrange the living room furniture. Ruby dear, I hope you don't mind. I moved some things around in the living room, just trying to make the space a bit more comfortable for me, Clara said one day, her tone polite yet firm. Oh, it's okay, I guess, I replied, trying to hide my surprise. It was her home too now, so I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But as days turned into weeks, these small changes became more frequent. Our house started to feel less like our home and more like Clara's. She had an opinion on everything, from the way I cooked to how we should spend our weekends. It felt like she was slowly taking control, and I didn't know how to handle it. Dylan, don't you think your mom is overstepping a bit? She's changing everything around the house. I finally brought it up one night. Ruby, she's just trying to make herself comfortable. It's not easy for her, you know, with her condition and all, Dylan said, sounding a bit defensive. I didn't want to continue the conversation. Dylan was clearly torn between us, and I didn't want to add to his stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's presence was slowly overshadowing our marriage. What started out as a wonderful journey together was now turning into something that I was not agreeable to. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. With each passing day, the house I once loved started to feel unfamiliar. Clara's influence spread through every room, her preferences shaping our living space. It felt like I was living in someone else's home. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find Clara rearranging the cabinets. Oh, Ruby, I hope you don't mind. I just can't find anything in these cabinets. I thought I'd organize them a bit, she said without looking up from her task. I had them organized already, Clara, but I guess if this makes it easier for you, I trailed off, feeling a sense of loss. Dylan seemed to be in a world of his own, often at work or taking care of Clara's needs. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and dreams, were now brief and mostly about Clara's health or what she needed. I missed us, the way we used to be. Dylan, can we talk? I finally said one evening after dinner. Sure, what's up? He asked, looking tired. It's about your mom. I feel like she's taking over our home. It's like her needs and wants are the only things that matter now, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Ruby, she's not well. She needs us. Can't you see that? Dylan replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. But what about us, Dylan? What about our needs, our home? I pressed on, feeling a lump in my throat. Look, I know it's not ideal, but she's my mom. I can't turn my back on her now, he said, looking away. The conversation ended there, but the distance between us grew. I started to spend more time alone in our bedroom, the only place that still felt a bit like mine. Dylan was either with Clara or working late. The laughter and love that once filled our home were replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated only by Clara's constant requests and suggestions. Our arguments became more frequent, each one leaving a deeper crack in our relationship. It was as if Clara's presence cast a long shadow under which our love struggled to survive. One night lying in bed, I turned to Dylan. Do you remember how we used to be? How happy we were. Do you want it all back? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at me, his eyes reflecting a sadness I hadn't seen before. I do, Ruby. I really do, he said softly. But the conversation ended there, swallowed by the silence that had become a constant companion in our lives. The house I had once been so excited to turn into a home with Dylan now felt like a place I just happened to live in. The kitchen was once my playground, a place where I could experiment with food and express myself. But that too changed when Clara moved in. It started slowly. At first, she would just make suggestions. Ruby, maybe you should try less salt. It's not good for the heart, you know, Clara would say, hovering around the kitchen while I cooked. I didn't mind adjusting a recipe here and there, especially considering her health condition. But soon her suggestions became more like commands. One evening, I was excited to try a new recipe I had found. It was a bit spicy, but nothing too intense. I thought it would be a nice change from our usual meals. Clara, I thought we could try this new recipe tonight, I said, showing her the recipe. No, my heart can't handle anything spicy. Let's stick to what I know, she dismissed quickly, clutching her chest as if the mere thought of spicy food caused her discomfort. But it's not that spicy. I think you might like it, I tried to persuade her. Ruby, I know what's best for my condition. Let's not take any risks, she said, her tone final. So I set the new recipe aside and cooked what Clara preferred. This became the norm. Our meals revolved around her dietary restrictions and preferences. Trying new recipes or flavors became a thing of the past. It wasn't just about the food. It was about losing yet another piece of myself, another aspect of my life that I no longer had control over. Cooking had always been my way of unwinding, of bringing joy to our home. Now it felt like just another chore, another area where Clara held the reins. One day I mentioned this to Dylan. I miss cooking the way I used to. I miss experimenting with flavors, I said, hoping he'd understand. Ruby, we need to be considerate of Mom's health. She can't have certain things, you know that, he replied, not meeting my eyes. I understand, but it feels like I can't even enjoy cooking anymore. It's always what your mom wants or needs, I said, a hint of frustration in my voice. Can't you just let this go for me? It's not like we're asking you to do anything major, it's just food, he said, sounding tired. I didn't say anything more. I didn't want to argue, but inside I felt a growing sense of loss and frustration. It was as if with each passing day, another piece of my identity was being eroded away, leaving me feeling trapped and voiceless. Things took a turn for the worse. One morning I was getting ready to do some grocery shopping when I realized my bank card was missing. I always kept it in my wallet in the same slot, but it wasn't there. Panic surged through me. I turned the house upside down looking for it, but to no avail. Clara, have you seen my bank card? It's missing, I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Oh dear, no, I haven't seen it. Are you sure you didn't misplace it? Clara replied, her face the picture of concern. I was sure I hadn't lost it, but what else could I say? I decided to let it go for the moment and use some cash I had stashed away for the shopping. A few days later, the bank sent a statement. I usually didn't bother with them, but this time I decided to have a look. Maybe there was a clue about my missing card. My heart dropped as I went through the list of expenses. There were several charges that I couldn't account for, things I knew I hadn't bought. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. There was only one person who could have taken the card, but I needed to be sure. Clara, I need to talk to you, I said, holding up the bank statement. What's wrong, Ruby? She asked, her eyes wide with what seemed like genuine concern. My bank card is missing and there are expenses here that I didn't make. Do you know anything about this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, Ruby, I took it. I needed medication and I didn't want to bother you or Dylan. My heart, you know. Clara burst into tears, clutching her chest. I was in shock. I didn't know what to believe. Part of me wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But another part, a growing part, was filled with doubt. I decided to tell Dylan about it. Dylan, my bank card is missing. There are charges on it that I didn't make and I think your mom took it, I said, bracing myself. Ruby, are you sure? That doesn't sound like Mom, Dylan said, looking bewildered. I confronted her. She admitted to taking it. She said it was for medication, I explained. Dylan went silent for a moment. I'll talk to her, but Ruby, if it was for medication, we can't really blame her, can we? He finally said. I didn't know what to say. The situation felt so surreal. I just nodded and walked away, feeling a mix of frustration, confusion, and a growing sense of isolation. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Something was off, and I was determined to find out what it was. I felt like I was living with a stranger, not knowing what to believe anymore. My trust was shaken, and I needed answers. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I decided to follow Clara one day. She had mentioned a doctor's appointment, but something told me that might not be the whole truth, so I grabbed a hat and sunglasses and followed her from a distance. To my surprise, Clara didn't go to a doctor's office. Instead, she entered a fancy restaurant. I felt my heart pounding as I followed her inside. I found a discreet spot where I could observe her without being noticed. I watched as Clara sat down with a group of women. There was no sign of illness or weakness in her demeanor. She was laughing, chatting animatedly, and seemed to be in excellent spirits. My heart sank as I realized that her doctor's appointment was a lie. I strained to listen to their conversation. What I heard made my blood boil. You wouldn't believe how easy it is to control them, Clara was saying. A little cough here, a little chest pain there, and they're putty in my hands. The women laughed and one of them asked, Aren't you worried they'll find out? Clara waved her hand dismissively. No, they're too naive, especially Ruby. She believes every word I say. Hearing my name made my stomach turn. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. I pulled out my phone and started recording their conversation. I needed evidence. I needed Dylan to see the truth. After what felt like an eternity, Clara finally left the restaurant. I followed her back home, feeling a storm of emotions inside me. I was shaking, not just from anger, but from the sense of betrayal. That evening, I confronted Clara. Clara, I need to see documents confirming your illness, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Clara's face paled and she stuttered, What? What do you mean? My illness is none of your business. Dylan walked in, his face showing concern. What's going on here? He asked. Clara has been lying to us. I have proof, I said, my voice firm. I played the recording from the restaurant. Clara's words filled the room, exposing her deceit. Dylan's face went from confusion to shock, then to disbelief. Clara's facade crumbled. Tears filled her eyes. I did it to keep control, to keep Dylan close, she sobbed. The room was filled with a heavy silence. The truth was out, naked and ugly. Clara's mask had fallen, revealing the manipulation and lies underneath. Dylan looked at his mother, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. I stood there feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the truth was out, but sadness for the pain it caused. Our lives were about to change, and I knew things would never be the same again. The air in the living room was thick with tension. Dylan sat on the couch, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. Clara was crying, her body shaking with each sob. I stood, feeling both drained and determined. Dylan, I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but we had to face the truth, I said, my voice steady but compassionate. Dylan looked up, his eyes red. I just can't believe it, Mom. How could you? His voice broke, the pain evident. Clara wiped her tears, looking up. Dylan, I was scared of losing you. You were all I had. I thought if I made myself seem needy, you'd stay close. That's no excuse for lying and manipulating us, Clara. You turned our home into a place of deceit, I said, trying to keep my anger in check. Dylan turned to me. Ruby, I don't know what to say. I was blind to it all. It's not your fault, Dylan. She's your mother. You trusted her, I said, reaching out to touch his hand. Clara tried to speak. Ruby, please, I didn't mean any harm. I pulled my hand away, feeling a surge of resolve. No, Clara, you crossed a line. You can't just play with people's lives and expect to be forgiven because you say you're sorry. It doesn't work that way. Dylan nodded, looking at his mother. Mom, you need to leave. This can't continue. You need to get help, but you can't stay here. Clara looked shocked. Dylan, please, I have nowhere to go, she begged. That's not our problem anymore. You made your choices, Clara. Now you have to face the consequences, I said firmly. Dylan stood up. I'll arrange for you to stay at a hotel for a few nights. After that, you're on your own. Clara stood still, crying. Please, Dylan, she continued. Mom, it's over. You need to pack your things. Dylan said, his voice laced with finality. The room fell silent except for Clara's sobs. It was a hard moment, but necessary. The confrontation had been brewing for a long time, and now the truth was out, raw and undeniable. I watched as Clara left the room, her step slow and heavy. I turned to Dylan, seeing the mix of emotions on his face. I knew this was just the beginning of a long journey for both of us. Dylan, we'll get through this, but we need to start by being honest with each other and ourselves, I said, taking his hand in mine. Dylan squeezed my hand, a silent promise of solidarity. The confrontation and confession had marked an end, but also a beginning of healing, of rebuilding trust, and of moving forward. It was going to be tough, but I was ready to face it head on. No more illusions, no more deceit, just the hard, unvarnished truth. In the quiet after Clara left, Dylan and I sat together, a shared sense of loss and relief between us. Our house, once a battleground of manipulation, now stood silent, a blank canvas waiting for a new start. Ruby, I'm so sorry for everything, Dylan said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, filled with regret. Dylan, we were both caught in her web. It's not your fault, I replied, squeezing his hand for reassurance. He looked at me, his eyes searching for support and understanding. What now? Can we start over? He asked. I nodded. Yes, we can, but we have to be honest with each other always. No more secrets, no more hiding. Agreed. We'll rebuild together, he said, a note of hope in his voice. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. We repainted the walls, moved the furniture back to where we liked it, and slowly, our house began to feel like a home again. We talked more, not just about what had happened, but about everything. Our hopes, our fears, our dreams for the future. One evening, as we sat in our newly arranged living room, Dylan turned to me. Ruby, I've been thinking, maybe we should renew our vows, start fresh. I smiled, feeling a warm glow in my heart. I'd like that, a new beginning. We planned a small ceremony, just close friends and family. Standing there, holding hands, repeating our vows, I felt a sense of peace. It was like shedding an old, heavy coat and stepping into the sunlight. As guests mingled after the ceremony, Dylan's sister Martha came up to me. Ruby, you're amazing. You've been so strong through all this, Martha remarked, admiration evident in her voice. I shrugged, smiling despite everything. We do what we have to do, right? Martha nodded, her expression serious. Yeah, but not everyone would have handled it as well as you did, she added. I looked around at the smiling faces, feeling a sense of relief mingled with sadness. Sometimes the hardest parts of life teach us the most important lessons, I replied. Dylan joined us, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. Like the lesson that some things are worth fighting for, he uttered. Yes, I agreed, feeling grateful for his support. And the lesson that truth, even when it's hard, is always better than living in a lie. We stood there, a little family united by trials and love. The intrusion of illusions had ended, and in its place was something real, something strong. In the end, this wasn't just a story of deception and manipulation. It was a story of awakening, of finding strength in adversity, and of the incredible power of truth. It was our story, and it was just beginning.